So I had quite a turbulent time growing up. I was thrown out of 2 different primary schools who basically claimed that they didn't have the resources to cope with me and my behaviour, which I always think, well, surely it's your job to have the resources, but we'll come back to that later. Anyway, I was diagnosed with autism, or what some of you might call Asperger's syndrome, named after a Nazi doctor, of course, who was involved in some pretty shady eugenics type stuff, and because of that a lot of us with autism don't really like to use his name when referring to ourselves. Personally, I tend to just say that I'm on the spectrum. You'll notice I've got some footage of me solving a Rubik's Cube playing in the background. There is actually a reason for that, which will become apparent later. But the way I would describe my experience of being an autistic adult is it's like I'm an undercover agent sent to this planet to learn and study human interaction. Because all of the social skills, like how to hold a conversation and so on, which come quite intuitively to most people, I would think, none of that was intuitive to me. And I basically had to learn the rules and subtleties of how people communicate with each other, kind of like how you might learn how to cook or you might learn how to drive a car, for instance. I like to think I've gotten pretty good at it now, but when I was at school I essentially had no social skills whatsoever. Like if someone came up to me and said, and this did happen, some people would come up to me and say, "Hi Midnight, how are you?" And I often just wouldn't respond, or sometimes I would just make like a grunting sound. Now with all of that in mind, it probably won't surprise you I had quite a hard time making any friends in the early part of my life, and that made me quite depressed. Because deep down, you see, all I really wanted was to fit in. I didn't like being the weird one who no one wanted to be friends with. And as a side note, being depressed with autism is a nasty combination. There's a misconception that exists that autistic people don't feel emotion, but actually what it is we have difficulty expressing emotion sometimes, which is totally different. And what it means is I can feel like I'm trapped in my body with my depression, and it's like nobody else can see how much I'm hurting inside, which can be very frustrating and makes the pain worse. If you happen to know an autistic person who seems frustrated and is shouting or seems to be angry a lot of the time, then do listen to what they have to say, because there are times I've found that shouting was the only kind of outlet available to me for the hurting that I was feeling inside. Anyway, the good news is that as I got older and my social skills improved and developed, I've been lucky enough to make some great friends, and I also have a wonderful partner now. And these tend to be people I've met in nerd circles where being a bit socially awkward is fairly common anyway. And that brings us to the subject of masking, which is when we put on a persona or front to hide the fact that we are autistic. And that's something I certainly do, and I don't consider to be unhealthy in itself, and the reason is we are all masking all of the time to varying degrees, whether we're neurotypical or not. All of us probably have a different persona or side to ourselves that we show when talking to our parents, for instance, than we do talking to our friends. And autistic people are no different. We just have to work a little harder sometimes to construct those personas, that's all it is. What's important is whether it's coming from a healthy place or a place of insecurity. And I like to see the persona I construct on my YouTube channel or the persona I have with my friends as a form of creativity and self-expression. It's not me hiding who I am, I'm just showing the side of myself that I want to show in that particular situation. There's one more thing I want to talk about, and that's stimming behavior. Now, stimming is something very common in autistic people, which involves repetitive movements or sounds we make, often when bored or stressed, as the stimulation has a sort of calming or soothing effect. The stereotype of what stimming looks like tends to be someone flapping their arms about, which is one form of stimming, but stimming can actually come in lots of different forms, some more extreme and some more subtle. One of the things I used to do, which would get me into trouble at school, was I used to hum and beatbox a lot, and sometimes I'd be doing this while I was in a class, like, well, we're supposed to be doing a test or something, which, as you can imagine, is largely what got me into trouble. These days I've developed more subtle and socially acceptable stimming activities, such as doodling. I always have lots of notebooks handy around the house. Biting my fingertips. I also sometimes like just rubbing my fingers together because my nerves are very sensitive there, and the feeling that provides can be quite pleasurable for me, I find. Another one I consider to be a form of stimming is solving a Rubik's Cube, and I've actually gotten fairly good at that now, to the point where I can usually solve my stickless little magic, that's the one I'm using on screen now, in under 40 seconds. The reason for that is I practice constantly, which is what you need to do to get good at speed solving. I have different cubes lying around the house on shelves, tables, windowsills, and often if I'm having a conversation or watching something on TV, for instance, I'll just pick one up and start doing solves. Now, I've not included this to show that my autism makes me smart or anything like that, because that's another misconception some people have about neurodiversity. I mean, I do like to think I'm pretty smart, but that's not because of my autism. That's just because I'm smart. But I just wanted to show how stimming can take a lot of different forms, including some you might not have even considered before. If there's an overall message in this I'd like you to take away, it's that I'm an autistic person, and I'm also a functioning adult and a member of society. There are some organisations and people out there who talk about finding a cure for autism, but the thing is, I don't want my autism to be cured because it's part of who I am, and I also think it gives me a unique perspective on the world. For instance, while I'm getting a lot better at understanding the little subtleties and implications of when people communicate, like when they say one thing and actually mean another because they're being polite or whatever, I still prefer to be blunt and direct as much as possible when talking to people, and I encourage others to do the same, because I just think that's a much healthier way for us to communicate. While I was homeschooled for a while and my parents had to fight hard to eventually find a school that would take me, from my point of view, it's not my autism that let me down. That's not the problem. It's the systems that failed me when I was young. Instead of looking at how to cure autism, we should be talking about how to make the education system and the world in general more accommodating to people like us. Because we can be part of society and accomplish great things just like anyone else when given the opportunity. This is Midnight Chimes, still waiting for the last train home.